Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream History by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Adair and Jonathan M.S. Pierce.
Hello, good evening, or
Hello,
good
hello.
morning, or depends where you are in the world, or indeed the universe, because this could be beamed out to the very people we are going to be talking about.
Yep. So you two are writing a new book together called Aliens and Religion When Two Worlds Collide.
This is true. So we've just finished writing the book. It's just going through the final sort of polishing up process, and it sort of came about when I wrote a feature article for Only Sky called "The Saved and the Damned of Proxima Centauri B." Which is Aaron will tell you what that's referring to, but basically it was this. I just wrote a feature articles because I was really interested in what the impact on religion, the discovery of intelligent alien life would be, and as I was researching it, I found a paper that Aaron give you a bit of an intro to that was really useful for me to structure my arguments around. And then I wrote this, and I know Aaron, and we've worked together before and whatnot. And he checked over the article, and he's like, "Yeah, I really like that article." And by the way, I used to work in this and that capacity. And then from there, we were like, "Oh, interesting." So we could write a book, couldn't we? And it's like, "Yeah, let's write a book." And it came out of that sort of feature article. Does that sound about right, Aaron?
Yeah, though I think I should fill in the gap about when it comes like I worked in that capacity. Previously, when I was doing my physics studies, I was an intern at the SETI Institute, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And for one summer in particular, I was actually using their radio telescope array up in Northern California, scanning the sky, making maps of neutral hydrogen, but also all those radio signals being pumped into a bank of computers looking for any artificial signals from outer space. So I can say I have some professional alien hunting under my belt. So you could say I've been working on this since 2007.
Yeah. And now it's come to fruition, and we're just pretty excited about it. I mean, it's one of those projects, one of those areas where you think, God, this is for me at least. This is like, oh, this is really original. This is going to be really interesting to get into this because I'm sure not many people have thought about this. And like anything in philosophy, like someone's thought about it 3,000 years ago, right? But in this context, there's a whole discipline called astro-theology, which is exactly that, the impact on theology of alien life. And so plenty of people have talked about this, thought about this, written books on this. So actually it's relatively new, but there's still and I suppose it's sort of nascent in a sense. There's not a massive catalogue of stuff on this, but there is enough stuff to really get your teeth into.
Yeah, for the theologians, a lot of it is theoretical because we can't claim we have discovered the intelligent aliens yet. They might knock on our doors tomorrow, or someone can prove that the things that we're seeing in those Navy videos are actually aliens rather than X, Y, or Z other terrestrial aircraft. But one way or the other, because we don't have the proof and it's staring us in the face with three different eyes, we still can only treat this somewhat theoretically. But nonetheless, a lot of theologians are like, you know what? The science is indicating more likely than not we're going to have cosmic neighbors. What should we think about that? So that way people don't get flat-footed or caught flat-footed, say in the same way when Europeans discovered the Americas and found out, oh, there's an entire continent worth of people here. How do they fit into the story of Adam and Eve, among other theological problems?
And actually, there are some really interesting parallels that you can draw from imagining how people will react to the discovery of alien life by looking into history and seeing how people reacted to discoveries in the New World, how sort of less advanced civilizations, how they reacted to the oncoming of new peoples and new technology and new ideas, and also things like the diseases and everything that spread as well. But yeah, it's that there are some interesting parallels. I guess, Aaron, the good place to start might be, what is the chance that there is alien life out there? I mean, that's your area of expertise.
Yeah, so the way that we approach this is a way that astronomers have been approaching this with something called the Drake equation. It was developed by the radio astronomer Frank Drake, who unfortunately died just a couple of months ago after living over 90 years, and was the first person to really start scientifically doing the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using radio telescopes. And the way that he tried thinking about this sort of problem was, okay, how many civilizations are actually out there? And when you got a problem like this, the way you can try to deal with this, okay, let's try to break it down into smaller chunks where each of those little chunks, I might at least, know a plausible range of possible values. And using that, trying to see, okay, how many likely civilizations are there in the Milky Way right now? Problem is, a lot of the numbers that go into this equation, which include things like what's the rate of star formation, how many planets for a given star, how many of those planets actually have life, how many of those life-bearing planets actually become intelligent, how many of them actually want to talk, and how long do they live. Those sorts of factors go in. And a lot of those factors, we basically have one good answer for those values, and it's shruggy. We can statistically deal with those shrugs, and that's something that we try to do in the book. I actually try, in some ways, pushing the science forward and how to actually address the problem. But nonetheless, it's still the case that we have a lot of big unknowns, but we also have big numbers. There are lots and lots of opportunities for there to be life in the observable universe. And potentially, the universe itself is infinite. It's something that's actually consistent with our cosmological measurements right now. And if the universe is infinite size, that guarantees there is life. So the only real question is there life in our observable universe, or even more interestingly, within our galaxy that we might actually be able to have reasonable congress with in the future of humanity? And that, I tried putting some estimates on, and the best I can say is we can't really show there is more than maybe a couple more civilizations in the Milky Way, and that's still an open question. On the other hand, if we do actually discover aliens, and there are several scientific ways that we could do that with current technology, if we were to do that, that would actually, well, scare some people, but I also try to argue on a scientific ground, it gives us optimism for the future of humanity, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, so and it's the idea is that you can put these ranges into the equation and then produce a range at the end. But as sort of Aaron was kind of hinting at, there's garbage in, garbage out there. So if you put rubbish data in, rubbish figures into that, then you're going to get rubbish answers out. And
yeah.
Aaron was looking at previous calculations that have been, analyzed or been done, and found them wanting, and as a result he did his own sort of number crunching. So there is actual maths in this book as well, and we've produced a new result for the Drake equation.
Yeah, and it's to do the best of what we can say empirically. This is what we can justify. Here's what we don't know, and here's how we can try to deal with that with some statistical rigor. And it's at least an improvement from other stuff where people just put in numbers that they just feel is right. And, well, feelies should not have that strong of a epistemic value in the sciences. So quite literally, if you go into the literature, you can find everyone saying from there should be millions of civilizations in the Milky Way right now to we're the only people in the entire observable universe. And when you get that huge a diversity in values, you know that we need to find some better way of constraining this other than just see how we feel about it.
Yeah, and I guess so. The end result is, I mean, we spend quite a lot of the initial part of the book looking at this question, and I suppose the TLDR of it is the universe is potentially infinite, and if it's not infinite, it's really, 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 really big. And if it's really, really, really big, then there's almost certainly life out there. And in fact, there's almost certainly an awful lot of life out there. Now, that might be different to how much life there is in the Milky Way, but given that there are potentially trillions and trillions, if not infinite numbers of galaxies, then it doesn't matter whether there's only 1, 2, 3 instances of life in the Milky Way. It would dealing with the issue of what's the impact of the idea of or the existence of alien life in the universe on religion. Then all it matters is out there. Now, whether we have contact or not is another area of discussion. And if they are really, really far away, it's possible that we will be quarantined by distance, which is to say that we are so far away from any other intelligent alien life that we will never kind of meet or talk or converse.
Yeah, and we should probably put some numbers on this. So, if I wanted to go to the nearest star system to our solar system, go to the Proxima Centauri system, which is only 4.2 light years away. So, if I could travel at light speed, I could get there in just a little bit more than 4 years, as measured by someone here on Earth. But with our current technology, if I had gotten aboard the fastest rocket we have ever launched into outer space, it would take me something on the order to 70 or 80,000 years to get to the nearest star. And as you can imagine, I would look a little bit grizzled by then, to put it lightly. And that's just to the nearest star. Our galaxy is home to something on the order of 400 billion stars, and our galaxy is one of hundreds of billions of galaxies spread across tens of billions of light years. So even if we could go the cosmic speed limit, it would still take billions of years, as observed by a person on Earth, to even get there. The universe is just so stupidly big that unless you have Doctor Who-like technology, you are not going to be visiting other worlds in any sort of reasonable time span in the same sort of way that we can cross oceans now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we are basically going to the second half of the book, saying, okay, we are going to assume that there is intelligent alien life out there. There's possibly a huge amount of it, and then the question is, okay, where do we fit in that context of there being intelligent alien life? And this is where you talk about, well, I'll just mention three things, and Aaron can qualify that. So you can talk about, okay, the size of the universe, let's say an infinite universe or nearly infinite universe. So you got loads of stuff. Okay. Add to this a principle of plenitude, which means that everything that is possible will be realized. Everything, if the universe is infinite, then the chance of anything existing that could exist in the universe kind of will exist in the universe somewhere, right? There's this kind of principle of plenitude. Then there's the mediocrity principle, which is sort of the Copernican principle, and we'll talk about that as super important, which is that there's nothing special about the Earth's status and position in the universe, and this has interesting impacts on like doctrine and theology. So we are not special, and this kind of led Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, to say, and I'll just quote him here about whether life exists in the universe. He said, surely may. There, we now realize, is an enormous number of planets, a range of planetary systems around the nearby stars, so there's a lot of potential abodes for life. That's one thing. Then there's a question of organic matter. The carbon-rich complex molecules that are essential for the kind of life we know about are fantastically abundant. They litter the universe. We see them in asteroids and comets and the moons in the outer solar system, and even in the cold, dark spaces between the stars. So the stuff of life is everywhere. And then there's time. There are billions of years for biological evolution on all those worlds, or many worlds that are much older than ours. So you put those together, lots of places, lots of organic matter, lots of time, and it seems very hard to believe that our paltry little planet is the only one that's inhabited. And I think that's a kind of good summation of like, okay, that's where we're going to start. Now what? Aaron? I don't know if the Copernican principle is something that's worth to sort of laying out before we sort of get into.
I think it is, because it's pretty central to a lot of the premises we make in our book. And so the Copernican principle is following the ideas of Nicholas Copernicus, that demoting the position of the Earth as some special point in the universe. We now see that the Earth is just one of the planets going around the sun. We also now see, hey, the sun is just one of the many, many stars of our galaxy. Our galaxy is one of many that are also very similar. We should basically realize, unless we have some reason to actually think better, we're probably middle of the road, average of what possibilities exist out there. And you can even get that from basic statistical reasoning. If you pull a number from a hat, you're more likely to pull a value that is more common, that is less common. And in that case, we should probably think whatever humanity is in the grand cosmic scheme of things, whether it's in terms of intelligence, violence, capacity for love, for hate, or anything else. We are probably middle of the road of what is possible out there, unless we discover otherwise and find out, oh, we actually are the angels among the stars, or wow, we are the dum-dums of the entire universe. Until we see that, we probably should think we're probably middle IQ, middle ability compared to what other possible civilizations are out there.
Yeah, it's a bit like the bell curve. So you're more likely to be somewhere in the middle of the bell curve than at the extremes. It's just like probability. So, you might think you're the tallest person in your house, Jacob, and then you might even think you're the tallest person in your village. But at one point you go out into the wide world and you think, right, I'm the tallest person in my village. Yeah, I'm really tall. And you go out there and actually there are shed loads of people out there that are way taller than you. And you suddenly find your places that actually I'm somewhere in the middle, or even if I'm fairly tall, I'm way away from being the tallest. And so therefore, it's like statistically speaking, on all of those traits and characteristics that Aaron just mentioned, morality, the amount of evil or the amount of suffering on any given sort of intelligent life planet, any of these things, we're just going to be in the middle. Like with not definitely, but we are likely somewhere in the middle. And if we're likely somewhere in the middle, what does this say about all these kind of theological ideas about the problem of evil? There's way more evil out there than there is here, or way more suffering out there than there is here. And if there are creatures that are way more moral than us, way more intelligent than us, when we talk about in the image of God, way more in the image of God than us, then what does that say about us for people who really think that we are the pinnacle of God's creation? And it's really interesting. That's one of the many things that we talk about. But I guess before we kind of get into the long weeds of it all, the other thing to talk about is abductive arguments. And abductive arguments are super important in the context of a book like this. So an abductive argument is an argument to the inference to the best explanation, which is to say that if you have two competing hypotheses, and the two hypotheses we have in the book are one, omni-God theism explains everything, right? And is reality. Omni-God theism is that you've got an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God. We pick that as the most common version of God. There are lots of other versions of God, but let's go with the most common one, omni-God theism. Competing hypothesis is naturalistic atheism. So the idea is, if there is intelligent life out there, does it better support the hypothesis of omni-God theism or naturalistic atheism? And also, take these two hypotheses and what do they better predict? What kind of universe would you predict on omni-God theism and naturalistic atheism? And then we can start thinking about, okay, so really the question is, does the discovery of intelligent alien life make omni-God more or less probable to exist? And that's really that's the question we are seeking to answer in this book.
Yeah. It's worth, of course, comparing that with, say, deductive reasoning, where we don't think we have some sort of logical argument. If aliens, therefore God doesn't exist. Nothing so absurdly stated. We think that ultimately it causes many theological problems, but it's not some sort of logical disproof unless there is a Christian group that says, according to their reading of the Bible, it is logically impossible for aliens to exist. And we will, of course, be discussing there are cosmological problems with reading the Bible. It does not make much room for other intelligent, naturalistic species out there like humans. But is it logically necessary? Well, considering how diverse Christians are in the interpretation of these things, it's pretty hard to say something's logically necessary, because every time you claim that, you just splinter off and make like 10 more denominations.
So, I mean, are you okay with this, Jacob? Because we're just going off on one. We're happily just barrel on.
Oh, sure. I like it a lot. I really do.
Oh, brilliant. Because so I don't, Aaron. Going back to the feature article I wrote, I talked about that there's this paper that I structured my article around, and actually that's a paper we structured our book around, and we split. So we deal mainly with Christianity, but we do have chapters at the end on other major religions, but we give them much less kind of room and analysis, because we're playing to our strengths, which is we know a lot more about Christian theology, but also audience and all that. So the main part of the book is therefore looking at the impact of, I mean, we do talk about the impact of discovering alien life on just humans politically, on ideas of psychology. We look at Leo Festinger's cognitive dissonance, which we'll come to later, etc., etc., etc. And then we get to, okay, Christian theism. And then we split that into 6 parts. Aaron, do you want to talk about the paper that we used?
Right, yeah. So this was an issue in the journal Philosophica Christi. So this was a journal specifically for philosophical issues for Christians. The paper was called Houston, Do We Have a Problem? So first off, it has a great title, so that's enough reason to cite it. And it, of course, I think was very good because it, tried looking through what they figured were all of the major issues that had come up either in previous literature or from what they could think about was the most difficult things. In some ways, what they found to argue against was a bit thin because most of their arguments were actually directed against Thomas Paine in his book The Age of Reason. There's obviously been many philosophers since Thomas Paine, but that was one of their major people that they were trying to have their not so much dialogue with, but trying to actually find people saying, hey, this is an issue for the Incarnation or other things like that.
Which is interesting, actually, Aaron, because and Jacob, because I was quite blown away that Thomas Paine had written about. I mean, this is back in what, the 1780? Oh, I could be wrong there.
1790s, 1800, right around there.
Yeah. So around that time, he was actually positing the impact of the discovery of alien life on religion. It's like, holy cow! Like that, you just assume the talk of aliens and so on and so forth. And actually, we can go on to talk about Giordano Bruno later. But it just that kind of blew me away. But anyway, sorry, yeah. There are 6 different areas on there.
Yeah. So in their attempts to address things, they are things that are very important, such as, hey, how does the atonement of Jesus work? That was probably the thing that is very difficult, especially if you're trying to understand, does Jesus need to sacrifice himself once and for all for the whole universe? And somehow us humans have to tell the whole universe about that, which, as hard as I try, I'm not going to be able to communicate that far off planet. Or is it that Jesus basically has to reincarnate into another form and basically do quantum leap and go from body to body, from planet to planet, to get himself killed over and over and over again and have to do the sacrifice for every single intelligent species in the universe until the universe itself dies billions and billions of years from now? And also meaning Jesus has probably been at this for billions of years because, again, Copernican principle would suggest we're also probably not the first civilization. So how long has Jesus actually been galaxy hopping to do his sacrificial work? Or is it a one-time thing? And this also all sorts of problems. And also the other issue is, more likely than not, there is more than one intelligent species existing right now. If Jesus has to be on both worlds at once, how does that actually work with the psychology of Jesus, and how does this fit with Trinitarian thinking? Or does someone just get to say something, something, something Trinity, something, something Jesus, something, something okay? Which is honestly how we found a lot of the argumentation to look.
Yeah, so the way we structured the book was in this section looking at the challenges for a Christian. There are 6 challenges. First one is a challenge to theism in general, sort of not necessarily Christian theism, but theism. If you discovered alien life, would that present a challenge for theism? Then it's challenging Christian scriptures, then Christian doctrine, then Christian tradition, then the problem of evil, and then Christian narrative. There's some overlap with those, but those are the 6 areas. So theism, scripture, doctrine, tradition, problem of evil, and narrative. And we kind of, walked our way through those different, chapters, taking those challenges and looking at what this paper set out as saying what they thought as Christian philosophers were the challenges and how they were solved, and then taken to the task over those claims and actually saying, no, we think there are more problems than that, and that doesn't really solve it for this reason and that reason. And so we sort of go to town on these 6 areas. So, I mean, the first area would be theism in general, and the understanding is, in a sense, the discovery of intelligent alien life isn't going to disprove God. As if you're talking about arguments against God, the ontological argument, things like that, it's not going to particularly challenge the existence of God. But there are, and that's what these two authors said, McNabb and McIntosh and McNabb. But we said, actually, there's a few things you need to think about. So one is a fine-tuning argument. So the fine-tuning argument, and the issue I have of the fine-tuning argument is that it's heads Christian wins and tails skeptics lose. And this is because, and this is really common. So you've got this universe, right, where it's just right, the constants are just right, and you hear this so often. It must be designed by God, because if there was anything wrong, we just wouldn't exist. And and then we are hanging on onto this world, and it's a Goldilocks zone, and we're just in the right zone to be able to have life. And isn't it amazing? Most of the universe has no life, but we're here, and this just proves life. And you're thinking, well, hang on. What would you be saying? So you're saying that's evidence for God designing the universe, that there's just maybe one instance of life, or maybe a few instances of life, and we're just hanging on, and the constants are just right. But what if the constants made life really easy? In fact, they're a really wide range of constants, and there was just life absolutely bloody everywhere. Just that the universe was teeming with life. The Christian would go, this is evidence for God, because look how easy it is for life to exist. And you're like, hang on, so you are claiming the entire spectrum of evidence the entire spectrum of the ability of life to exist, from here to here, no matter where you exist on that continuum, you are saying that's evidence for God designing the universe. I don't like that. That's having your cake and eating it too. Do you have anything to add to that, Aaron?
Yeah, and it is worth noting, when it comes to the fine-tuning arguments, they actually, have, in a sense, two different fine-tuning arguments that are at odds with each other. The fine-tuning that the universe is designed for life, but also the extreme rarity of the conditions for life, showing how everything has been nicely engineered for us. So it's like, wait, life is designed to be existent and abundant, but also designed to almost never happen. These are very much in tension, to say the least. So, it goes on top of the other issues.
But it gets worse than that as well, because actually, when you really look at it, this universe is fine-tuned for death. Like, with black holes, with disease, with all the things, and this is where you start to get into teleological arguments. So arguments from poor design. It's just like, if again, let's go back to this abductive kind of argument, which is like, what would you predict of the universe given omni-God theism? If God was love, would you predict black holes? Like, if you started with, right, I know 100% that God is infinite love, right? What universe would I imagine if that kind of God existed? Would I be predicting black holes, disease, like all the ways that you can die, all the ways you can have pain and suffering? It's like, well, no, I probably wouldn't. And so therefore, it looks like the universe is fine-tuned for death.
To be fair, if there were infinite love, I would predict black holes, because there'd be infinite gravity.
Don't get all scientific on me, Aaron. Jesus. But I use a rabbit hutch analogy, which is, imagine Jacob. I say, Jacob, come around my house, mate. I want to show you my rabbits. I've got these 3 rabbits. I've just been designing this rabbit hutch and rabbit run for them, right? So come around. And you come around my house, and we go out into my back garden. You're going to love this. This is a lovely hutch. And I open the door, and I show you my rabbit hutch. And there are these 3 rabbits. And I say, I built them this hutch. And the hutch goes up to the moon. Literally, the roof is as tall as a moon, right? And you're like, okay, that's a little bit big for these rabbits, right? And I say, yeah, and it's great. And these rabbits, they just live here, but just over there is this a boiling pond of lava and fiery oil. Right, so the rabbits go over there. But you know how much I love rabbits. But anyway, I've put that there just in case they do that. And then, there's a vortex over there. They shouldn't really go over there, but if they do, they'll get sucked into the vortex. And you start looking around this kind of thing that I've designed for them, knowing that I love rabbits. I've got infinite love for rabbits, right? And I've designed this thing for the rabbits to thrive. And yet, most of it, they can't experience, because it goes up to the moon. What's the point of me building this hutch to the moon? And then, most of it they'll never experience, and parts of it they'll experience and die. And again, what would you predict before I open that door, that if I was the most loving rabbit person and designing a hutch and a run for them, what would be the kind of rabbit hutch and rabbit run you would expect me to design? And it wouldn't look like that. And that's the kind of parallel with what this universe looks like to humans. I don't know, but there you go. And so then we got onto like teleological arguments, which say that, again, it's the Copernican principle. So if you look at human design and you say, right, we've got loads of really bizarre things, like we die in childbirth really easily, we all this, all the common arguments of the really terrible design that just with human life forms. And you say, we're going to sit somewhere in the middle. So there's going to be aliens out there that are going to have even worse design features than us. And if it's more difficult to explain away the most difficult poor design features, so for example, you could say that, right, we get backache, right? That's really bad design, so we get backache a lot. This one's commonly used. You could kind of explain that way and say, well, God just made us have backs that gave us backache because, a bit of challenge doesn't hurt anyone. It's like, okay, but then we die in childbirth or cancer or this kind of, we really like to get this, that the more difficult the issue is, the more difficult it is to explain away, the lower the probability of God existing, right? So when you then say, well, if there are alien life forms out there that have far worse design features than us using the Copernican principle, then actually it lowers the probability of God existing because you have to explain those even more difficult to explain things. And it's very like the problem of evil. It's the same argument we use of the problem of evil, which is that if the worst thing on this planet was that we stubbed our toes, right, we could explain that away quite easily in terms of God existing. But when you start getting onto genocide and cancer and malaria, those things are more difficult to explain. And if they're more difficult to explain, they lower the probability of God existing. Even if it's a small effect on the probability of God existing, it has a non-zero effect. And that's the same case with if there's even greater suffering out there than what we experience, then it lowers the probability of omni-God existing.
And to add to that, we were building off a paper from another philosopher who was taking the idea of the problem of evil and say, but what if aliens? Because again, taking that Copernican principle, what is the worst thing that has ever happened in human history in terms of suffering and evil? Whatever that is, it's still probably the case it's not the worst thing that has ever happened in the entire universe, which means whatever badness or difficulty this is to explain on theism, there must be something else out there that's even harder to explain on theism. So the question is, well, how do we then account for that and update our probabilities for that? So building off one of the previous papers, we kind of, in some sense, completed the math steps so I can give a more exact statement. If you think such and such is this improbable on theism, here's what the new probability will be on theism plus aliens. And it brings the probability down by usually a pretty significant margin.
So this is the chapter we did on the problem of evil, or on the problem of suffering, however you want to sort of label it. But this was, this is one of the most powerful arguments anyway against the existence of God, one of the most emotive and one of the most kind of useful if you're using it in your toolbox. And the discovery of intelligent alien life scenario makes it an even more powerful argument and lowers the probability of, that argument alone lowers the probability of omni-God existing, and as I say, as Aaron said, he's done the maths, so it must be true.
It's worth the price of the book all on its own.
Yeah, for sure. So that's this teleology. So we spend a little bit of time talking about these kind of problems with design and looking at that in the alien context. And you hear this, and we get onto that in the doctrine section, which is this broken model, the kind of fix the broken model creation, which is actually how most theologians understand creation on earth, which is that we are a broken entity, we're a broken species, and we're fallen, and we need to be fixed. And of course, this then brings on all the kind of normal arguments you have anyway about this, which is like, what kind of designer designs something that's going to break, that needs fixing? It's just what a bizarre thing to do, and then demand a payment for that. But we'll come to that in the atonement. So the next section we look at is scriptures. And Aaron wrote a brilliant section on this about biblical cosmology, because the scriptures, I mean, aside from aliens existing, we took this opportunity to just go, actually, this is a great opportunity to look at the Bible and say it's absolutely 100%, 180 degrees wrong on biblical cosmology. And actually, you can ditch your Bible just on that alone. Do you want to talk about that, Aaron? Because that's your neck of the woods.
Yeah. In fact, if you want to see some of this discussion as well, it relates to a live stream I did on Myth Vision a couple months ago with Kip Davis and Joshua Bowen, where we were looking at the attempts to get around the Bible being a pretty clear flat Earth set of documents. That it continued with what was the ancient Near Eastern cosmology of a flat Earth with a hard metallic-like dome that keeps the waters above separated from the waters below, and that's where rain comes from. That's where the gods live, up on top of that dome there. That was the world as seen for thousands of years by people in pre-scientific times. And the thing is, though, those beliefs persisted into the Bible even at times when people actually started to know better, when they started to know about better the shape of the earth. They still continued to use the beliefs and the phraseologies of flat eartherism. And what's up above us? Is it more stars with other planets that you could go and visit? No, that was not the universe that was imagined by these people. Stars were either just little dots left in the firmament in the dome that's above the earth, or they were angels themselves, which people then could become upon their own deaths. These were not places that you could go and visit and discover new alien species. Where do you be to go and be in the afterlife, not as a place to go with rocket ships? And again, it's worth noting, when the New Testament was written and it was having this belief in like astral immortality, where that's where Jesus went, after his death and resurrection, people already were imagining traveling to the planets and visiting aliens there. And the Epicureans even believed that all the stars had their own planets and their own civilizations around there, that they just naturally formed. And the Bible explicitly decides to go against that. And Christian theology, for 1,500 years, completely denied this. And it denied it while being completely, utterly wrong. So if this is how you're going to try to map out the universe, or think this is a cosmic message, and it gets the cosmos fundamentally wrong, you got to stop back and think, okay, is this just the sorts of mythology making of every other primitive group of humans that have been around for tens of thousands of years, or is this actually how God likes to communicate, through crummy pre-scientific myth?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing, that if the Bible is this sanctioned, optimal revelation of God, right? If this is how God is doing the revelation with humanity in the best possible way, which you've got to assume it has to be, because otherwise God is not being omnibenevolent, because God is producing a revelation which is suboptimal, and then expecting us to believe and have faith, but with this suboptimal revelation, and then punishing us for not having faith or whatever. So you've got to think that it's some kind of optimal revelation. But if it's downright incorrect, and this is being rubber stamped by God, then that's a massive, massive problem, because essentially God is sanctioning deception. This is disinformation. Well, it is misinformation in terms of those people, but it's disinformation in terms of God, because God knows everything, and God is saying, "Yep, that's fine. That's the revelation I'm going to go with," which is entirely scientifically incorrect, and that's a big problem. And then it falls over into another chapter. I mean, I haven't talked about like the main issues with the scripture. I mean, just this alone is a massively important component. But then Aaron, do you want to talk about Giordano Bruno and how which fits into the Christian tradition chapter?
Yes. So this was actually in some ways the section that got me a bit angry, because I discovered that so many of the Christian philosophers and historians were trying to basically bury this history the best that they could, because if you actually look at the whole story, you realize it makes the whole thing look very, very bad. So just let's give some background. Giordano Bruno was an Italian I don't want to say scientist because a lot of his thinking was very magical, not so much like mechanical philosophy science. But nonetheless, he was an early adopter of the Copernican system, of the solar system, and in particular, he was entranced by the ideas of the Epicureans, where basically the universe is just filled with stars, with planets, with other peoples there. That basically the universe is infinite and all the possibilities exist out there amongst the stars. And this eventually got Bruno into trouble. He was taken in by the Inquisition, and after years of interrogation, looking to see which of his beliefs were to be considered heretical, he was eventually put to death in 1600, and his death was quite brutal. That his tongue was basically like first staked through, so he couldn't talk anymore, and then he was burned at the stake in front of crowds of people to cheer on the burning of the heretic. Today, there's actually a statue of that location where he was burned in. I'm forgetting which city that's in right now. Padua? My memory is fuzzy on that right now. But for the longest time, we didn't really have the records to actually explain what things he was being accused of heresy for. Some people overdid it and said he was being persecuted for being an early Copernican. So he basically was Galileo before Galileo. This isn't quite right, but in the 1940s, we finally found like the trove of documents that was basically, the Inquisition records. Okay, now we can look through and see what was going on there. And apparently, one of the biggest things that was, getting the Inquisition upset, that they were asking about the most, and they had as among the 10 reasons to kill him as a heretic, was the belief in the many worlds and their inhabitants. So he was explicitly executed for believing in aliens.
Which is really important because a lot of Christians, even now, like modern Christian historians, claim that he was not executed for that, and they downplay the idea that he was presenting things that are now accepted as fact, right, or accepted as eminently plausible. And so they downplay this and say, he's executed for other things because it doesn't look too good. And in the paper that we talk about, they kind of don't really go into the true facts about Bruno's death, and this is a challenge for Christian tradition, as in, like, here's an example of how Christianity holds on to certain traditions in certain contexts and will punish you for going against the tradition. So what we say is that actually here's evidence, very explicit and on point evidence about this very subject, that someone was executed for presenting these ideas. And so you can bet your bottom dollar that if we discovered alien life existing now, there will be certain Christian denominations who would deny it, and it will fit in line probably with your fundamentalist, evolution denying sort of Christians will bury their head in the sand, and then sort of, but there is a tension between, or at least there certainly has been a tension between Christian tradition and Christian traditionalists and the idea that intelligent alien life exists. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, it's worth noting that when Bruno was executed in 1600, it wasn't like this one-time thing, that this was just something that came up amongst the historians who actually did the deep diving into the research of this tradition, and they found like multiple popes that had condemned the possibility of many worlds, as they called it, the possibility that there could basically be other Earths with inhabitants on them. This was literally condemned by multiple popes before the 1600, other inquisitors, things like that. There was just like this long history of both Catholics and Protestants before 1600 who are all absolutely clear: no aliens, this is a no-go, this is a heresy, this is an obvious heresy, why are we even talking about this? And nowadays it's like, this was never a heresy, this was never a problem, the church was totally open. Here's this one guy, Nicholas Acusa, he seems to be totally okay with it, even though when we read him in context, he's basically like, maybe it's somehow possible, but they won't be as good as humans because we're the top dogs. And that, again, completely goes against the Copernican principle, which we're talking about here. So even the examples they try pointing to, once you look at the context, you realize at best they're not reading the whole thing, and at worst there's just straight up lies going on.
And it's just really interesting because you time and time again, you just get examples of how throughout history, how Christianity is just like anti-intellectual, or at least anti scientific fact, and it takes a long time to come round, is when the evidence is overwhelming. And we congratulate certain Catholic thinkers and the intellects and people who were involved in Big Bang cosmology and evolution itself, the theory of evolution itself. And Catholics often clap themselves on the back and congratulate themselves for being so open to modern science. It's like, yeah, that's cherry picking your kind of successes there, because there are plenty of evidence to suggest that actually when things buck the trend of Christian tradition, people get burnt at the stake. So yeah, that's biblical cosmology and the idea of the scriptures. So the big thing that McNabb and McIntosh say is that the scriptures don't say anything. There's this silence here. So therefore, if aliens exist, that's fine. It doesn't contradict the Bible, but because the Bible says nothing about it. So the question is, should we expect to have evidence in the Bible, some kind of prophecy in the Bible, or at least some indication from God or from prophets or from Jesus that intelligent life exists out there? Or should it be, is there good reason to think the Bible should just indicate pretty much that we are the number one dudes and it's all about us and we are the apex of creation? Because that appears to be what the Bible is pretty much saying. So the question is, would we expect the Bible to predict or to communicate that aliens exist? And that's difficult. I mean, it depends whether aliens do exist, right? So you have to get into these kind of hypotheticals here. And if there are aliens that exist, but we're never going to meet them and they're effectively irrelevant, then maybe it's fine for the Bible to say nothing. But if aliens exist and they're going to come knocking on our door and then maybe kill us all, like in 500,000 years time, then actually the Bible probably should have said something about that. So do you know what I mean? Like the argument from silence is a bit dodgy there, and it just depends in what ways aliens exist. Is that fair,
Yeah.
Aaron?
Yeah, and that kind of bleeds into the narrative section where if aliens do exist, does this actually upset the Christian narrative? And in the most extreme case, what if aliens exist and they want us dead? So among the things that I did in the book was try to give some sort of estimate of if aliens could actually come here, and supposing they can actually get here at significant fractions the speed of light, how advanced would they have to be? How much more powerful are they than us right now? And there are some scales that we can use that for talking about energy terms. And I did some fairly back of the envelope calculations and figured if an alien species can get one of their vessels here at roughly 80% the speed of light, their civilization must be literally at least 1 million times more powerful than ours, which also can tell you pretty quickly who's going to win in that fight. We, talk about what happens with the conquistadors with flintlock muskets versus the Native Americans. Well, if the aliens come and we already have the technology that we could eliminate ourselves in a few hours, you can imagine what a civilization 1 million plus times more powerful could do to us. And you don't even necessarily need super advanced technology to do it. You could easily wipe out entire cities just by throwing a rock at the earth really, 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 really hard. Like quite literally, if you had a 1 kilogram rock, about 2.2 pounds, and launched it at the Earth at 99% the speed of light, it would have an impact energy greater than the Tsar Bomba that the Soviet Union detonated back in the 60s. And that's just a rock. Get a whole bunch of those rocks and you have eliminated all life on Earth in a matter of a flash. And that's just flinging rocks really hard. And this is not even thinking like, oh, what if they could take Earth and drop it into the second dimension and we could become a completely flat Earth, and not flat like the flat earthers think, but I mean, we literally exist in 2 dimensions. If they had stupendous technologies like that we can't even imagine. Even imaginable technology is just so beyond us, they could easily defeat us. So when in the McNabb and McIntosh paper that we address, when they basically talk about, well, what if the aliens are hostile? They seem to have the assumption we'd probably win or, fight to a draw. And I'm just like, dude, like, we don't even have 5 minutes. I mean, it's not a good movie, but the movie Battlefield Earth is probably a bit more accurate, that the war between humans and the aliens coming would probably only last about 5 minutes. That's the greater reality. Again, look at the technological difference that we keep pointing about between like the coming conquistadors and the Native Americans, and also that story is a little bit fudged because there were basically native groups fighting on both sides. But nonetheless, we looked at that technology difference and said, well, that's why the conquistadors won. They had much better technology. Well, a flintlock is going to look like less than a pointy stick versus someone who can actually fire relativistic impactors from another galaxy. It's like, no, this is just not even a comparable level of technologies. This is just not anything that we could quote unquote win.
I hope the viewers can just tangibly experience some of Aaron's excitement there. Considering the imminent destruction of the universe and science fiction, and also, this is why it's been a pleasure to write this book. So going back to Christian scriptures and the impact of discovery of intelligent alien life on Christian scriptures, you've got this idea, like I was talking about, if God hasn't told us about aliens and probably should have done, then is this an example of divine deception? And in the McNabb and McIntosh paper, they talk about how deception's fine, and they basically use consequentialist ethics to say that, if there's a good enough reason to lie, then lying's all right type thing, which is interesting in itself, because actually a lot of Christian philosophers don't really like consequentialism because you don't need God for that kind of moral value system. And so, William Lane Craig famously called it a terrible ethic. Well, okay, but there's an interesting tension there. But there's also in the scriptures something called the problem of particularity. So the problem of particularity is a thing that's a problem without aliens, right? So the problem of particularity, there are two sides to this. One is that you can only access salvation through Jesus. This is the only way you can do it. So it's very particular and you need Jesus, which is interesting. Okay, if you take that with aliens, then the aliens need Jesus. And therefore, how does that happen? So, and we kind of hinted some of the solutions that you could have either one, Jesus does them all, or then there are problems, and that's one of the biggest parts of the book, and we'll talk about in a second, or trillions of Jesus. But the other version of the problem of particularity is how particular Judeo-Christianity really is. Like, it's a certain point in time. I mean, this is an argument against omni-God theism anyway. It's like, if you're born in the wrong place at the wrong time, you don't get to access any of this stuff. You don't even understand it. And really, I have to circumcise myself to be part of this gang? I mean, why do I have to? That's a bit of a poor design thing if God wants me to cut off the very thing he's designed. And it's a bit of my penis, and that's weird. And then you get, well, then I had, never boil a goat kid in its mother's milk or whatever. You have these really bizarre moral rules throughout the Bible. You've got 613 of them in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, and you've got all the New Testament rules and rituals and stuff like that. And you think, how do these map across to the universe? Like, if we have to be circumcised to be the right ones, if you believe in some kind of Jewish version of the whole thing, then what does this say about aliens that don't even have those appendages and have completely different biologies? And what do all these kind of rules mean to them? And what if I can't mix if I can't mix wool and linen, then what is that? I can't eat shellfish. Do they even have shellfish on Proxima Centauri B? And so you've got this problem of particularity, which is, it's a really weird and particular religion. And it doesn't sound very universal. And if you're talking about like extrapolating all of these moral codes and this thing across the universe, then it doesn't really seem to make any sense. And then you kind of, well, okay, if it doesn't need to make sense, then it doesn't need to make sense to me. And then actually, I don't need these. And so you start unraveling the Bible by seeing that really is just this parochial book that came out of a very particular time in a very particular place. And you can start having arguments about, an Amazonian tribesperson 5,000 years ago, like, how do they get to be saved, and then you can apply these sorts of arguments to, okay, well, someone born in a different planet in a different galaxy, et cetera, et cetera. So there are issues with the scriptural side of things.
Yeah, and just to take it to a interesting story, was a short story written in the 70s dealing with the issue of particularity related to aliens who wanted to become full-fledged Jews or enter basically the larger synagogue. And this story, it's from the 70s, and the title is "On Venus We Have Got a Rabbi." And there's these discussions between all these Jewish groups whether this new species, the Bulbas, can they actually be, full-fledged Jews, or are they actually some sort of like second-class citizen because, all the anatomy issues and other things like that? How can they follow the dietary laws? Are they actually part of the covenant? How can they be sons of Abraham? Things like that. And literally the way the story concludes is with this edict. This is how they decided. There are Jews and there are Jews. The Bulbas belong in the second group. And that's about as good as you're going to figure out how to solve these problems of particularity. It's basically you're just going to go, whatever. That's about all you can do.
Yeah. And, and with each of these we're just rushing through these, but there are so many different arguments to consider. And it is certainly, very interesting. But we then move on to the doctrines chapter. And the doctrines chapter is probably the biggest, meatiest chapter, because that's like, right, what is the theology going on? So it's not necessarily about whether we should have expected. But one thing to say about should we have expected aliens to be mentioned in the Bible? Talking about prophecy in general, this is just a general point, which is that the prophecies we do have in the Bible are just really, really shoddy, and they predict things like a war happening, and then someone winning that war and someone losing that war. And it tells you virtually nothing because anyone could guess that. But at no point in time did anyone prophesy in the Bible like intercontinental ballistic missiles, or like germ theory, or, vaccines. No one predicted a car or hoverboards or the internet. Like, how amazing, like that would be prophecy. If someone sat down and said, hey, do you know what? In like a couple of thousand years, we're going to be able to do X, Y, and Z and do it like that. And then a couple of thousand years later, that happened. You'd be like, they were on there is some kind of truth to this. But it's rather convenient that all the prophecies in the book, in the Bible, are just, there's going to be a war, someone's going to win it. And it turns out,
or there's going to be a rumor of a war.
Yeah. And it turns out that all of those prophecies were only ex eventu anyway, which means to say they were written after the war, and then predated to predict the war. But there you go. So anyway, doctrines and theology. The first one is Imago Dei, or in the image of God, and that's obviously quite interesting in terms of the Copernican principle. I've done some talking. Aaron, do you want to take over on that?
Yeah. So this is all relating then to how we're going to fit the Jesus story into him supposed to be spreading the good news. Is it a one-time event and we're special? Or does Jesus need to do this for every single civilization? And both of these things present problems. So first off, if we are the special ones and Jesus only visited one intelligent species in the entire universe, in the entire universe's history, isn't that just a new form of geocentrism, that we are truly the special place in the universe and all the other ones, it's like, you don't matter as much as us. Somehow, some reason, we are the special ones. And a lot of the astro-theologians look at this and realize this is just, backtracking on what we've learned about, the Copernican principle. Unless we have a good reason to think otherwise, we are not special. We are one among many. So how in the world do we make sense of Jesus coming to us particularly and dying here particularly?
Well, actually, no, it's before that issue. So the image of God issue is to do with, like, what does it mean to be in the image of God? So before we get to the atonement, it's like, what does it mean to be in the image of God? Okay, it's to be rational, it's to be this, it's to be that, it's to be X, Y, and Z. And no one really knows exactly what that is. It's a bit of a guess. I mean, it's not to look like us, because again, that would really be a problem if there are intelligent alien life forms out there, because they're not going to look like us, and therefore they ain't going to look like God, and God ain't gonna, so we can forget the kind of corporeal version of God and that you might see in the Hebrew Bible. So it's going to be a mental, we are made in the image of God in our mental characteristics. And the idea is that with the Copernican principle, there will be intelligent alien life forms out there that are more in the image of God than we are. And how does that fit with what Christians, how they interpret the Bible, and how they see us as the apex of creation, and how they see that we're in the image of God. How does that make us feel now to think, oh, there's someone else that's even more in the image of God? Oh, we're not so special. And actually, when we look at like a capuchin monkey or even a frog, right? And we go, yeah, that's not really in the image of God, is it? Like that frog's not really made in it, or that capuchin, not capuchin monkey, that capuchin is not, it's not really in the image of God. I mean, it's got some pretty substandard forms of rationality, as a proto sense of justice, but it's pretty shoddy in the image of God. We're way better than that. Now imagine we humans are the capuchin or even the frog, and you've got other alien life forms out there that it's so far superior to us in the image of God that we in reality are effectively parallel to the capuchin or even the frog. And then, oh right, that really brings us back down to earth, so to speak.
Yeah. And then related to that as well, if they are also so high in their image, their relationship with God, it could be the case that maybe they are not even fallen, which then, of course, has the question, well, if God can create intelligent species that are unfallen, then why are we basically left holding the bag and have to go through all of this rigmarole about having to be sent to hell for how we were created? If clearly God could create intelligent species that are unfallen, why couldn't we have been part of that same group? It seems like God has decided, like, I could do that, but for the sake of diversity, I'm going to have, massive suffering throughout the universe. And then, of course, on the other hand, if all species are fallen, wow, that means God literally can't make anything good. This is also, it seems like, to misuse the phrase, God is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't.
Yeah, and it goes into the Theological arguments again, because it looks like God really is a crap designer, because there are trillions and trillions of intelligent life forms out there, and they're all fallen. And the kind of conclusion, I mean, we looked at, so one of the questions we ask is, would intelligent alien life be moral? And the question is invariably yes. They would have moral dimensions. Surely they must. But you could argue that they don't, and you can even argue that intelligent alien life could even be technological, and we do talk about that, but we probably won't talk about that now. But there are like different, what does intelligent alien life even look like? So we do have those discussions. But would alien life be moral? Yes. Okay, let's assume that there must be. Okay, then if they are moral, would they all be broken? Would they all be fallen? And this is what Aaron was sort of hinting at here. And the idea is that you would assume that they probably would be fallen. Although C.S. Lewis wrote a space trilogy whereby he had people living on, I think, Mars or Venus it was, who were not fallen, and we go along and then actually we kind of make them fallen type thing, almost like a contagion. I think I haven't read them, but he plays around with the idea that there are intelligent alien life forms out there who are not who are not fallen. But in reality, like Aaron was saying, it would be really unfair if God could make unfallen creatures, but we are the ones that just get chosen to be fallen. I mean, I didn't choose, like, none of us chose that. None of us chose what happened with Adam and Eve, if you believe in that literally. And so, we that wasn't, we had no impact on that happening. And we had no impact on our own design. So to make us fallen and others not fallen, it seems to be really unfair. So you would assume that there are all other intelligent alien life forms are moral, and they are all fallen. And there will be intelligent alien life that is more moral than us, a lot more moral than us in the Copernican principle. And then you get onto the question, okay, so if all alien life forms are fallen, do they all need atonement? So is atonement necessary? And these take up a huge part of the book, right? Is atonement necessary? And I talk about how atonement is just incoherent anyway. But aside from that, is it necessary? Well, you'd assume it has to be. Otherwise, why do we get atonement and not everyone else? And then, okay, what's the optimal form of atonement? Was Jesus incarnating as in human form the optimal type? Will you think that if God is all loving, he would go for the optimal and blah, 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 and all these kind of discussions. And then you get onto the idea that, well, if we've got the optimal form of atonement, and all these other alien life forms need atonement, they would have an optimal form of atonement, because if they don't get the optimal form of atonement, then that's unfair. And so, you start playing around with all these ideas, and it ends up with the idea. I think the most sensible idea is that all intelligent alien life forms get their own Jesus. But in astrotheology, there are some who believe one Jesus on Earth does it for everyone, pays for everyone's sins in the entire universe. So Ted Peters, who's a really big astrotheologian, he advocates for a single Jesus doing all the atonement. And then a lot of others say, actually, no, you would need a trillion Jesuses existing, often simultaneously. So there are going to be civilizations around the universe that need that atoning Jesus at the same time, which means Jesus has to be potentially in millions of places at once. Aaron?
Yes. And considering how hard it was for Jesus to even be in both Jerusalem and the New World at the same time, even that took some time, according to the Mormons. It would seem like it'd be very hard for Jesus to be literally in multiple galaxies at one instant. And how does that even work psychologically? So that was, a little bit of, well, I don't want to call it head-scratching explanation, because for the most part, the paper that we addressed basically just says he can do it. We already believe in the Trinity, so we can already believe in multiple entities being one entity. So if 3 can equal 1, 3 billion can equal 1, no trouble. Which, of course, to us is just like, well, you already proved you can't do math once. Now, doing it a trillion more times isn't making the problem any better. But yeah, it seems like if God is depending on us to communicate to the rest of the universe the salvation message, those aliens out there are in big trouble, because for one thing, again, the universe is stupidly big. Even with our best radio transmitters, it would take millions of years for our radio signal to get to the Andromeda Galaxy. And by then, it would be so attenuated they probably couldn't even pick up the signal anyways. And the transmission rate would be so slow that it would also probably take thousands and thousands and thousands of years to even, read out the whole story. And that's assuming anyone's even there, like pointing their telescopes in the right direction at the right time and all that. And by the way, Andromeda is the closest major galaxy to the Milky Way. The universe is so stupid big that literally even with infinite time, we couldn't reach the ends of the universe even if we could travel at near light speed. So if it depends on us to let the whole universe know what's going on with this Jesus story, we will fail not because of our own inabilities or our lack of technology, but we literally would have to fight the laws of the universe itself. So basically we'd have to fight God to get God's message out there, which sounds like a terrible strategy.
So a lot of astrotheologians advocate for a single Jesus does the entire atonement. And of course, atonement, as I say, is a problem. Like, why you would design something that is broken and then demand payment from some third party for the fact that that design that you have made is broken is just really bizarre. So atonement, like, I could talk to you for some time about how nonsensical atonement is, but it is entirely nonsensical. Something I deal with in, I'm going to spam you, in my latest book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, which I talked to you about, Jacob, in a previous interview. But yeah, so one of the problems of this single Jesus is the idea that God would, as Aaron was sort of hinting at, God would have to kind of magically play out the atonement passion narrative to all these other civilizations around the world, so that they, like some kind of divine cinema, I don't know, or put it in their brains or whatever, like, so that they understand this story. But they would have to confer from that. There would have to be exactly the same amount of value from that as having it done as part of their own civilization, because it would be unfair of God to give it. And this is what Ted Peters admits is earth chauvinism. So we cannot derive more benefit from having the atonement take place here than any other civilization out there. Right? If they're getting it played to them on some kind of divine cinema, they need to have exactly the same amount of benefit from that and conceptual understanding of that. Now, imagine, like, you are sat here, Jacob, and like suddenly you are made to watch this divine, like, cinema of some passion narrative of some, like, gaseous entity, like, supposedly suffering, and you're like, how would you be able to psychologically empathize with an alien life form that was so unlike you that it just didn't fire, like, it wouldn't fire those empathy like those mirror neurons in your brain that allow you to empathize and sympathize. Because when you see the Passion of Christ, right, Mel Gibson's film, and it's getting flogged and, you know, it really overdoes it, but the idea is the suffering is so intense, right? And you could, because you are imagining, when you're watching that, you are imagining that's you, that you're the one getting scourged, right? You're the one that's getting tortured and laughed at and put up on the crucifix, right? But if you now have to see this as some kind of alien being that you can't empathize with, then that single atonement narrative story is surely going to be less effective for alien civilizations as it is for us. So that for me is one of the main arguments, and there are Astro theologians that agree say it doesn't really work. I think you need a trillion Jesuses, but the problem is a trillion Jesus is a really bizarre and problematic thing. And in fact, Aaron, do you want to talk about how McIntosh and McNabb try and explain how a trillion Jesuses could work psychologically?
Yeah. So their idea is that, okay, they're going to accept that Jesus basically needs to do his atonement on every single world to basically, you know, spread the good news and get the, you know, sacrifice going for everyone. But this also means that, considering the size of the universe, far more likely than not, there is more than one civilization that at one time is going to have a Jesus on their world. So there could be a Jesus here on Earth at the same time there is a Jesus in a distant galaxy. And this now means basically Jesus has to be occupying two or more bodies at the same instant. And, you know, of course, it's, you know, hard enough to have a conversation with two people, but, you know, trying to literally be two people at once and, you know, suffer in two places at once, or to have two Last Suppers at once, is mentally, we might call impossible. But they try to get around and basically say, maybe Jesus has the equivalent of multiple personality disorder, but not in a disorder way, just in the way that makes Jesus sound good and not the way that Jesus sounds bad. But also, if they are trying to use the idea of multiple personalities, insofar as that diagnosis works for humans, it's not the case that you have both personalities at once. You're kind of like switching back and forth between the two. So if you actually follow the psychological literature, you can't be both personalities at the same instant. It's a switch back and forth. So even their metaphor, which would require Jesus to start taking some lithium to help with his problems, it wouldn't even explain this problem of being two people at once, and, you know, trying to be personable as two different people at once, light years apart.
It's just worth saying there's a few people in the live comments there saying, Jonathan is trying to psychoanalyze aliens now, and Jonathan's lost from an entitled view, and he's a spoiled child. I really don't understand where that's coming from, right? What we are doing, like, it's worth letting you know that the arguments we are just presenting are arguments that Christians are presenting against other Christians. So what we do is we eat the popcorn and watch single Jesus atonement theorists argue against multiple Jesus atonement theorists, and we take down all their arguments, and then we look at what multiple atonement theorists argue against single atonement theorists, and we take down their arguments. And basically we're compiling a bunch of arguments that Christians are using against Christian, and of course they're both wrong, because they both got valid arguments against each other's position. And it's like the multiple incarnation model is fundamentally broken, and the single incarnation model is fundamentally broken. In other words, you know, if intelligent alien life does exist, I think the atonement suffers no matter which way you look at it. So it's interesting that I don't know if I think Brad is a Christian himself. He can have a go at me for saying this, but he really needs to go and read the Astro-theologians, take Ted Peters, for example, and go and read some pretty hardcore chapters from, you know, Ted Peters, John Russell, and all these other like really big thinkers who are expressing exactly what we're saying here. So this isn't like us sitting around like picking arguments, picking little nitpicky holes in Christian thinking. I mean, it is that, but these are Christian arguments against other Christians as well. And so, you know, I don't know if that changes opinions at all, or whether, you know, you still think I'm a sport child. I don't know. Whatever.
Well, I'm definitely spoiled. I also will note when it comes to us trying to quote-unquote psychoanalyze the aliens, one of the things we also note in our book as well, that when we try to actually think about what are the thought processes of aliens, of any other intelligence, or anything else that might participate in the Imago Dei, the image of God, we basically figure this much. Whatever is the diversity of humans in terms of neurotypicality, aliens are going to be at least that diverse. So we can talk about, things on extreme levels, but we can also say we expect the aliens to be at least as diverse as us. And again, if we're following the Copernican principle that we are somewhere in the middle of the road for there, it also be the case that there will be plenty of alien species that will have emotions in line with things that we have as well. So love, hate, pain, pleasure, hunger, horny, all the various important emotions that humans have, the aliens will have with some diversity, maybe even more diverse than humans, but we can still have reasonable enough analogy that we can actually talk about it. It's not the case that only humans know what love is.
Sorry, I was muted there. But so Jacob, did you want to say anything at all?
Well, something I've been wanting to ask. Do you think that, Dr. Dare, do you think it's possible that human beings in the future could develop a kind of engine in which ships can travel very, very fast over star systems beyond what is believed to be the cosmic speed limit?
So beyond the cosmic speed limit, so going faster than light. That is something that I did some research on what is the cutting edge physics that we have right now. So in terms of the techniques for actually trying to beat light speed, the two things that you'll see coming up the most is either wormholes, also known as Einstein-Rosen bridges, and some form of warp drive, basically ripped right from Star Trek. And strangely enough, there is actually quite a bit of physics research that has gone into both of these. In fact, when it comes to warp drive, there's been papers since the early 90s showing that we could actually get something consistent with general relativity that would actually allow us to go faster than the speed of light. But, and there's a huge but, they are not consistent with other conditions that we would expect. In particular, all the various methods that I have seen that would try to get us to go faster than the speed of light require something known as negative energy or exotic matter. Now, what does that actually mean? If you had a chunk of exotic matter, it'd basically be something that would have like a negative mass. So like every object that you have with mass is attractive to each other. If you had something with actually a negative mass, it would actually be repulsive gravitationally. And amongst the weird things this could do is you could produce perpetual motion machines that get infinite amounts of energy. And pretty much every single time your math says you get free energy, you need to stop and say, okay, that's wrong. It seems to break conditions that would be required by energy conservation or by what we understand from quantum mechanics. As far as we can tell, all the various techniques that we would need to break light speed either have what seem to be physically impossible conditions to achieve, or otherwise it leads to all sorts of paradoxes. In particular, if you can go faster than light, it gives you the same effect of being able to go backward in time and produce all the time travel paradoxes that happen like every other week on Doctor Who or any other sci-fi where there's time travel involved. The most common version of it being the grandfather paradox. What if you went back in time and killed your grandfather before you met your grandmother, in which case you wouldn't exist, in which case you wouldn't have gone back to kill him, but then everything would be back to normal. And those sorts of paradoxes seem to suggest that either this is logically impossible, or if it's not logically impossible, it sure looks like the universe has done everything it can to prevent that. So it seems like to keep causality on the tracks, faster than light speed appears to be impossible. Could we go very, 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 very close to light speed? That seems far more plausible. And to whet your appetite for this, one of the current projects going on right now is something called Project Starshot. And it's basically the idea that we're going to take extremely light pieces of, to be a bit gross with it, tinfoil, something very reflective, and fire extremely high energy lasers at that so it can get up to 10-20% the speed of light and shoot these things with a small computer and camera on them and send them to Alpha Centauri or Proxima Centauri. And if they're going 20% the speed of light, instead of taking tens of thousands of years to get there, it'll get there in a matter of years or decades. And we might have the technology to do this by mid-century and then actually have the ships there before the end of the century. We might be a generation that actually can get high-def pictures of planets in another solar system up close. But this is going to require not only a huge amount of investment and advances in technology, it's also going to probably be at the limits of what we'll be able to ever do as humans in the future. Best case scenarios I've seen is maybe we could develop a ship that can go 90-ish% the speed of light, which has its own radiation problems. If you go super fast, that means every single charged particle in the universe looks like it's coming at you at almost the speed of light, which basically means it goes from stationary particle to high energy radiation particle. So if you're not well protected, then basically you crank up the engine and then you just turn into a giant tumor. It's going to be very hard to do this. And as for breaking the light barrier, I'm pessimistic at this point. I'd love to be proven wrong, but right now I'm pessimistic.
You're muted, John.
Yeah, sorry. I just, Aaron, because basically we presented most of the arguments, or at least a selection of the arguments, actually. I mean, there's so much more that we talk about. But Aaron, do you remember you thought about that extra argument? I was like, that's a brilliant argument. And I can't remember what it is now.
The eschatology problem?
Remind me.
So basically, how is it going to work with all the end times predictions for the world as either on single incarnation or many incarnations? So let's turn your Bibles open and read Revelation, and Jesus says, "Behold, I come quickly." Now, we've already been waiting about 2,000 years for "come quickly," and Christians have tried to say, well, a day is like 1,000 years and all that. But here's the real problem. What about with other civilizations? Now, again, we're probably not the first civilization. In which case, if Jesus had to incarnate on previous old worlds, there are probably civilizations where Jesus visited them millions of years ago, and now that civilization is extinct. So Jesus didn't come back in time for the end of the universe, because clearly the universe hasn't ended. And if Jesus needs to go and make this promise to every single civilization that emerges, and civilizations are going to continue to emerge naturally for hundreds of billions of years, and Jesus has to complete all those incarnations before the final congregation, "Behold, I come quickly" looks like a total joke if quickly means 100 billion years.
Yeah. So of course, these if you've got the one incarnation model, then civilizations are been and gone and been snuffed out.
Yeah.
As we look to the sky and we see a twinkling in the sky, and you think it's taken 3 billion years for that light to reach us or whatever, then there's a civilization or trillion that now cease to exist. And if our Jesus is the one that pays for all the sins, then actually their sins weren't paid for. And then how does that work? And it makes it all very, very confusing. And what happens is the Christian has to then twist and warp theology to try and fit and do add-ons, which is kind of what has happened over history anyway. I mean, that's the adaptability of Christianity, right? And I get when we look at all these different arguments, and there are more that again that we haven't talked about, but when we look at all these arguments, say, right, it appears to us that these arguments make omnigod theism less probable than otherwise, than without intelligent alien life. But there's this other argument, which is the not abstract argument, which is a psychological argument, which is how would people actually react if aliens came down to us, and how would religious people react? How would Christians react, for example? I mean, would they be like, holy crap, this wasn't in the Bible, and then just and our conclusion is broadly the power of cognitive dissonance. And the interesting thing about cognitive dissonance, so just to let people know if they don't know, always talk about cognitive dissonance because it's so pervasive in human psychology, which is you have a core belief and then you have evidence that's contrary to that core belief, and that they butt against each other, and they cause disharmony in your brain. And brain doesn't like disharmony, so you have cognitive dissonance reduction, which is a way of reducing this disharmony. Now, either the evidence is kind of ignored, buried, compartmentalized, whatever, just goes away, or it's adapted and is harmonized to your core beliefs so that they are interwoven, or very, very rarely you change your core belief so that the new evidence changes your mind. But we're not very good at that. And Leon Festinger discovered this back in the 60s, I think, and the
50s.
Was it the 50s? The beauty of this was he discovered it by infiltrating a UFO cult. Him and his psychoanalyst buddies, colleagues, infiltrated a then quite famous UFO cult that was getting in the news. And there was supposed to be this rapture moments. And we've seen this throughout history, these different Harold Camping and all these rapture moments that come and go. And then, oh dear, it didn't happen, and you'd expect that their core belief would play second fiddle to the evidence that comes along to butt up against that. But the core beliefs are strong. So what they do is they say, well, the evidence is okay. We didn't get zapped up by this UFO because we got the date wrong, and actually it's this day, and then it all changes. And so what he found out is that people didn't really. A couple of people left the cult, but most people stayed. And not only did they stay, but they became more fervent in their belief, right? And that's really interesting. So you then look at Christians or any kind of religious believer, and you see intelligent alien life coming down, landing at the White House or wherever, and aliens getting out with guns or with flowers, whatever. The likelihood is that humans would retain their religious belief and adapt the new evidence to their belief system, and their theology would adapt to incorporate intelligent alien life happening. So although for us it reduces the probability of God existing, for theists, they would probably just adapt to the new data,
Yeah. And of course, it'll depend on the theist. Like, most of our effort has been looking at traditional Christianity, and in particular, the paper we were addressing was a couple of Catholics. But when we look at other world religions or spiritualities, some groups will be more adaptive than others. It'll be easier for them to accept it. And in particular, the groups that I found that'll probably have the easiest time accepting aliens will be those from like a Hindu or Buddhist background when believing in incarnation. They just believe that now it's possible you could incarnate as an alien, or vice versa. And the Mormons basically have already been believing in aliens since the very beginning. I was actually very impressed looking at like some of the earliest writings of like Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, and they were very pro-alien and the existence of other worlds. You can almost say they're ahead of their time, except that there were people like in the newspapers at the time saying, "Oh, there are bat people on the moon." There were stories like that going around in the 1830s. But nonetheless, the Mormons basically already effectively believe God is an alien and that we can become like gods, and God was once like us. So the Mormons will basically say, oh, there are aliens out there? God made those too? Yep, no problem. It'll be others holding to Trinitarianism and things like that. They're going to have a harder time. And Jews and Muslims will also have their issues of particularity that we mentioned, and their relationship, of course, with the biblical cosmology. We discuss a little bit about Islam and some of the attempts to say, oh, the Quran predicted aliens in the first place. No, it didn't. And also some interesting things in modern culture where it's kind of interesting. There's interesting parallelisms I've seen between how Christians have dealt with aliens and UFOs in the 20th century and how Muslims have as well. So, for example, a lot of alien cults in the US and in Europe in the mid-20th century, but towards the later half of the 20th century, there's all these beliefs in alien abductions that these aliens were bad and evil. So all of a sudden, aliens and UFOs became demons. In the Islamic world, very often you'll have at least some Muslims say that the aliens are actually, or that the spaceships are actually piloted by jinn, basically more Arabic-inspired demons or devils of sorts.
Yeah, and when you look, I mean, Ted Peters has even done surveys himself in the past, and other astrotheologians and researchers have looked at data to suggest that Christians, for example, wouldn't really be affected by the existence of intelligent alien life. But it appears that most actually Christians who have been asked about this haven't really thought about it before, and so some of the data is a bit crappy, really. And also, there appears to be evidence to suggest that the more fundamentalist you are, probably the more that you have an issue with it. And it depends on what kind of idea you have about authority, and there are other kind of psychological dimensions to consider when you're thinking about how people will react. And they've done, we cite some research that looks at like difference between how Americans will react and Chinese people will react, and whether there's cultural differences that will have variables, psychological impact on the manner in which you would react to discovery of intelligent alien life. So yeah, that's stuff we also discuss in the book. So it's quite wide ranging.
What would you two say is the most damning evidence against the existence of God?
To me, it's probably the problem of evil. That was the thing that, when I was still a believer, that I struggled to how to make sense of that. And it was one of the reasons I left being a believer in the first place, because it seemed like if I'm going to make a universe and I'm going to, want to be this great loving being, I wouldn't create a world with childhood cancer. And why am I having a higher morality than the creator of the universe?
And that's really important with regard to this book as well, because when we talk about the problem of evil chapter, and Aaron talks about how there's much greater evil, much greater suffering that will exist on some of these other planets and whatnot. So if you imagine some kind of Holocaust as being like the worst, like, it's a bit sort of cliche, but let's take that as a word, or a tsunami killing 230,000 people, or Holocaust killing 6 million Jews, or whatever. Some kind of thing that we've got in our minds is like the worst thing that you could possibly imagine that's happened in the history of this world, right? And then you think that might have happened somewhere else, to not just on one small part of one planet, but over maybe an entire galaxy or a solar system or something like that. So there could be a solar system that was teeming with life, and it was entirely destroyed by a black hole, or by some disease, or by some other aliens, or whatever, right? In some kind of mass genocide on a scale which is unimaginable to us. Now, if we take that Copernican principle into account, then the problem of evil is a really big problem. So if Aaron's there saying the problem of evil is a real, that's what made me sort of disbelieve. And he's talking about like an amount of suffering that was potentially really moderate in comparison to what there almost certainly is out there in the universe, then actually, this kind of intelligent alien life presents a really big problem for belief in that kind of God.
And of course, if we say it's all part of the divine plan, we could still say, hey, that's a pretty terrible plan. And in science fiction, there's a great example that comes up just to this sort of thing, of an entire civilization being destroyed all for the sake of the divine plan. It's a short story from Arthur C. Clarke. I think it was published in 1954, and it's called The Star. And it has a future Jesuit astrophysicist traveling to another galaxy to explore a supernova remnant. And while in this mission, they discover that orbiting this world was basically the archives left by this ancient civilization that basically knew their sun was going to go supernova. There was no way they were able to escape it. So they basically created this archive on the most distant planet they could build on to try to preserve whatever remnants of their civilization they could before they were completely snuffed out by their own star. And the, archaeologists and Jesuit astrophysicists there, they're exploring this, and they see this was this, wonderful, creative, peaceful, loving civilization. There seemed to be, nothing terrible about it. It looked like it could have lasted for thousands of more years wonderfully, and then it was snuffed out by that supernova. And then the Jesuit is able to then do the calculations and figure out when the star went supernova, how long it would take the light to go from that star to the Earth, and realized, oh my goodness, this was the Star of Bethlehem. And then the Jesuit is like, God, why did you commit this entire civilization to the fire just to have this one star showing up in the sky? And a major crisis of faith for this person is like, this was the divine plan. Destroy an entire peaceful civilization just for a light show. Yeah. Sometimes the divine plan sucks.
Which, everyone should get Aaron Adair's book, The Star of Bethlehem by Aaron Adair, A Skeptical View. Excellent. And I think it's, these sort of issues, the problem of evil is obviously, really, really common one. But I think the intelligent alien life scenario makes it even more difficult, more problematic to believe. Yeah.
Well, I think we can end there. I thank you both for joining me today. This is been a fascinating discussion. And maybe we can have a part 2 at some point to continue discussing other aspects of the book whenever it comes out?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm hoping for early next year. As I say, we're just going through the sort of polishing it up,
Mhm.
but it's predominantly done, and just getting some other people to have a look at it. But it's definitely, yeah, it's something different. It's an interesting topic, but it does dip into a lot of the arguments that that we know very well. As I say, the argument from evil, fine-tuning arguments,
Yeah.
theological arguments, loads of sort of philosophy, as well as loads of science that Aaron is really good at communicating.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think some of the interesting things we were able to do as well is also, how could we actually determine if intelligent aliens exist in our galaxy or elsewhere in the universe? What things could we do legitimately in like actual peer-reviewed, publishable science rather than the various stories of abductions or the blurry images in sensors? And we discuss some of that in the book as well, of what is the quote-unquote best candidates for direct evidence of extraterrestrials either visiting us in the past or in the present. And, well, let's just say this much. We take a generally skeptical view on those sorts of things, but boy, oh boy, I would
What
love
are
to
you
be proven
saying,
wrong.
Aaron? Of course, an alien's going to wait to develop the suitable technology over thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Get to this point where it's going to be a really expensive use of energy to go right across the universe at the speed of light to come and hang out around our planet and think, oh, I wonder what's going on there. And instead of knowing that from afar by being able to monitor us, they feel that they have to come down, abduct some drunk guy from Ohio and shove a probe up his ass, because that's definitely what they're going to go the other length of the universe to do. I mean, it's obviously what
Well, actually, when they went
out.
to Ohio, they were actually chased by the police all the way to Pennsylvania. That's actually a true story from the 60s of a couple of cops thinking they were following a UFO, and they were driving over 100 miles per hour from Ohio all the way into Pennsylvania, and most likely they were probably chasing the planet Venus.
Yeah, because, as you do.
Yeah, there's lots of good stories with that, and so, yeah, I am sure there's plenty of things that we might want to discuss about. Can we actually show that aliens have visited us in the past? Are they here in the present? And what can we legitimately do to show that they actually are out there? Like, what can we actually do with our science or with our near future science to determine they're out there? And conversely, do they know we're here?
I mean, but I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that in the same token that I dismiss the Bible and I dismiss Christianity on slavery alone, there are certain things, if this is really going to be the holy text, your revelation, right, and it justifies slavery in a way that certainly the Hebrew Bible does, and then the New Testament kind of builds on that or takes it in a different direction, but there's still elements of that there, and that is absolutely morally abhorrent. Some of the countenancing of slavery that God himself dictates is so problematic that I reject the Bible on slavery alone, right? You forget all the other inconsistencies, nonsenses, and the flood and the 10 plagues of Egypt and all that nonsense. I reject it on that too. But just slavery alone does it. Well, actually, I think on biblical cosmology alone, you can reject the Bible. I just as some kind of divine revelation, because you have to say, oh, it's just a book of its time. Well, if you can say it's a book of its time on those scientific claims, then you can say it's a book of its time on moral claims, on ritualistic claims, on theological claims, and you can dismiss it as just being a book of its time. You can't cherry pick the context argument. You can't say, oh, it's just, yeah, but that's what they thought in those times. Yeah, okay, I'll apply that to all the other crap that's in there as well, and I'll say that I can dismiss that. Because if I can dismiss it, the science bit there, and the belief about the reality of the universe, then I can dismiss all the other bits about the so-called reality of the universe. So I think, I really think Aaron's points about biblical cosmology being completely wrong aren't to be overstated. They can't be overstated. They're just hugely important.
Yeah. And in fact, to add to that, just to emphasize the point, it's not even just that the Bible was wrong, it was a product of its time. When especially the New Testament was written, they could have known better, and they could have actually attached themselves to positions that we know are at least more correct and instead it was rejected. The Bible could have supported atomism and the existence of other worlds, because that was a belief that had been around for centuries before Paul wrote any of his letters. So the fact that the Bible could have done that, it was an available intellectual option, and it rejected it, says it's even worse than a product of its time. It's actually even primitive for its time.
Well, thank you both for joining me once again.
Thank you, Jacob. Really appreciate that, mate.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.